I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. The first anniversary of the Albanese government today was meant to be the start of a big week for the Prime Minister, hosting leaders of the Quad at the Sydney Opera House. This is a grouping of leading democracies in the region, the US, India, Japan and Australia, all wary of China. The Prime Minister was certainly looking forward to hosting the most important summit in Australia in years, until Joe Biden pulled out. The US President made it to Japan for the G7 and held a meeting with Anthony Albanese, but he's heading straight back to Washington today to deal with the debt ceiling crisis in Congress, the latest hyper-partisan standoff engulfing American politics. The Sydney Quad Summit was promptly cancelled, with a quick catch-up held instead last night on the sidelines of the G7. At the same time, China is extending more olive branches. It's dropped sanctions on Australian timber and invited Anthony Albanese to visit Beijing. You'll hear from the Shadow Foreign Minister, Simon Birmingham, a little later in the program. He joins us from Adelaide. First, the panel, Phil Coorey, Clare Armstrong and Shalailah Medhora. Let's start with what's happened overnight in Hiroshima, the sidelines of the G7, the Quad meeting that did finally happen last night, our time. They've, agreed to a range of things. Clare, how would you best summarise the outcome of this fairly brief Quad meeting?
Well, I think what's important to remember is with these kinds of events, most of what's going to be agreed is already well in train before all of the leaders get in the room together. So what we saw overnight out of Japan wasn't vastly different than what we would have probably seen out of Sydney in a few days' time. And that was essentially a show of strength against China without obviously saying the word. A lot of discussion about peace and security and freedom in the Indo-Pacific, some pointed comments about how all countries and peoples in the Indo-Pacific deserved free choice. So quite strong language there, even though they weren't mentioning China. That was probably the big takeaway.
It's interesting you make that point, right, because they don't say the word China, but we've got a little bit here of, you kind of get the drift of what they're talking about, right?
Standing together for an open, stable, secure and prosperous Indo-Pacific region.
To our vision for a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific.
Our strong commitment to our common vision towards a free and open Indo-Pacific.
And that is to advance our vision of a free, open, secure and prosperous Indo-Pacific.
Free, open, secure Indo-Pacific. Phil, who on earth are they talking about there?
Oh, Charlie, it's obvious. I mean, the Quad, full name Quadrilateral Security Dialogue was formed as a dialogue of like-minded nations in the region to, sort of push back at China.
Is it proving to be a worthwhile grouping?
Look, it's very embryonic. I mean, there's only the fourth leaders meeting.
The third one, or face-to-face.
Yeah, they had two virtuals. Look, in comparison with other sort of fora like G20, G7, it's a fairly flimsy thing. It's very much about the optics, the Quad. It's about these four leaders get together every year, and that's really what matters. They sit together, and that's the message they're trying to send to the region. India was sort of reluctant sort of participant, but has now been brought on board. Its national interest is a bit divergent to the other three members. It's much more independent, but getting India on board was important. But it's all about being seen. They sort of dress up this agenda around a bit of window dressing to give it this sort of substance, but it's really about the optics, and that was why it not going ahead in Sydney was...
Yeah. One of the interesting things they did agree on is a statement of values they finally settled on, and it's basically saying to all the other regional bodies like ASEAN, Pacific Islands Forum, Indian Ocean Rim, that we respect and will work with you. They don't want to tread on their toes.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about the Quad and that is that it's had this informal kind of slow growth, but it's becoming a point that other organisations can now interact with. And one of the things that's really interesting is countries like South Korea are talking about doing multilateral work with the Quad. So even though it's, inherently four countries as per its name, it's kind of grown into, because I think of its informality, it's able to be a bit more fluid, a bit more dynamic, make the kinds of statements that the leaders made at the end of the meeting last night. And other countries can interact with it as a collective rather than necessarily be having to use the traditional forums, like many of the ones you mentioned, that often include countries like China.
Yeah, and no surprise, Shalailah, China does not like the Quad at all. The ambassador made that very clear.
Yeah, that we're being targeted, even doesn't matter how softly quickly you go and how you don't mention the C word. They know what it's all about, though, don't they? So I think they're looking at it very closely, looking at the outcomes very closely. I think that critical minerals is a really interesting one for China because they have a stranglehold on this particular industry at the moment, and Australia has what they need. So I think that's a really interesting one for us to keep an eye out on.
Yeah, look, it is, and that brings us to the meeting between Anthony Albanese and Joe Biden. Now, there are a couple of really interesting outcomes from that. One is this new climate compact, or climate clean energy and critical minerals compact, and saying this is now, what do they call it, an essential element of the alliance, or a third pillar. The third pillar of the alliance. What does that mean?
Well, I guess it's been like the bilateral relationship on climate change and clean energy has now got the same status as the Defence Alliance, I guess. I think that's what I mean. Yeah. If it's the third pillar. What's the second pillar? Is it economy, trade? I'm not sure. But the elevation...
Would be trade. We have the free trade deal.
But the elevation in status. So that's quite significant. I guess Claire's sort of better briefed on this than me, but in terms of what it actually means in practicality. I mean, they put out this completely impenetrable statement last night. It was.
If it's impenetrable for you, Phil,
no.
Let's just pick it apart. So they've agreed on this compact. They've also agreed something that Australia's been asking for. Joe Biden will go and ask Congress to include Australia, give Australia special status under what's called the US Defence Procurement Act.
Yeah.
Claire, this could be quite a big deal.
Yeah, so it slightly depends on how Congress agrees to define Australia, whether we're domestic or a domestic source. But essentially what it could lead to is that Australian companies involved in the supply chains that the US Defence Act nominates as critical, which includes obviously defence industry, but also things like critical minerals and renewable energy technology, or clean energy technology. Australian companies could get subsidies, they could get access, priority
from the US.
From the US. It means that in the reverse, where the US president might dictate that the private sector has to do more of something, that could flow through to doing more of things with Australian companies. So it's quite significant.
Yeah, this potentially, there's a lot of hope around what this could lead to, not just critical minerals, hydrogen as well.
The statement spoke about cooperation on investment, so that raises the prospect: can we get our hands on some of that IRA money? The IRA,
this is the Inflation Reduction Act,
which is
huge,
hundreds of billions dollar
subsidies
to
attract all the clean energy.
And the IRA is acting like a giant vacuum cleaner at the moment. It's just sucking all this global investment and interest into the US.
Isn't that also part of this $2 billion fund that was announced during the last federal budget?
That was our little version of it.
That was our little version of how we can make Australia a clean energy leader in hydrogen and how we can export that to the world, basically.
This could potentially be a lot bigger than that if it means we're treated as a domestic or
essentially
domestic
that's
production
particularly
source.
for AUKUS. A part of the reason we've pushed for it so much is because of what the amount of sharing and supply chain issues that obviously
are going to be
a deal like AUKUS, not just the submarines, although there's a lot to unpack there, but the second tranche, I guess they call it, which is the quantum, the AI, all of those, those hypersonic missiles.
So at the moment, only Canada gets this special treatment from the US. If we get it as well, if Congress gives the tick, that's significant. I want to talk about the fact the Quad meeting was not a standalone summit in Sydney as it was meant to be. The President was meant to be there and then go to Canberra to address the Parliament as well. Anthony Albanese was very understanding.
The blocking and disruption that's occurring in domestic politics in the United States with the debt ceiling issue means that because that has to be solved prior to the 1st of June, otherwise there are quite drastic consequences for the US economy, which will flow on to the global economy. He understandably has had to make that decision.
He's right there, Phil, isn't he? Joe Biden didn't really have much choice, did he?
No, he didn't. I know Anthony Albanese likened it to Fraser blocking supply in 1975 and another... No, of course not. I mean, the consequences of the US defaulting on debt would be far graver than not turning up for a couple of meetings in Sydney and PNG, but that still doesn't mean that it wasn't a diplomatic setback that he couldn't go to PNG in Australia.
Yeah.
Both things can hold equally.
Well, particularly PNG, where they called a national public holiday. He was meant to sign this defence pact.
Yeah, I mean, it just sends... and I know there's all this there's a bit of an argument in the foreign policy establishment about this, but no one is saying the US has reduced its commitment to the region because of this, but optically, its detractors can say it looks like that, right? Because its domestic politics is such a basket case. It can't, it's impeding now its foreign policy agenda. So it's a PR thing. It's not a real thing. But it's not been a good look for him not to be able to do the rest of his visit.
It's not without precedent to not have a leader show up for some of these meetings. But this time the threat is very real. Like the state of American politics makes it extremely precarious for the president not to show up.
I think that's a good point. And arguably the nature of the contest in the Pacific is also more serious than it was when Obama or Bill Clinton.
Obama had to cancel once because of a debt default.
Well, I think as well Beijing really made some lemonade with Australia's lemons. The Global Times, which is obviously China's sort of media mouthpiece, was, I think, pumping out opinion pieces by the hour about how it was the end of the Quad, it was the end of US supremacy in the region. It can't be relied upon. And it's easy to sit here and laugh at the Global Times, but when we are in a very real contest for alliance and support in the Pacific particularly, this was to be the first a sitting president to visit PNG, to visit a sitting country. So I think it can't be understated that will have an effect.
And there's no sort of Douglas MacArthur, I'll be back. President Biden's response is to invite Anthony Albanese to the White House for a state visit, which was, the old marching band on the South Lawn affair.
It's just because things are going to heat up in the US, so it makes it more difficult.
But he's also going to have another Pacific Leaders Forum in Washington to make up for the PNG thing, which is sort of not...
And the Americans are saying it's a postponement, he'll still make it to Australia. You'd think, though, 18 months until a very difficult election. Not great chances.
They also say that Albanese has had some of the most FaceTime and engagement with Biden than any world leader. He's had so many one-on-ones, and that will be their argument. I mean, look at the kinds of agreements that came out of last night, and there's a lot of talk that obviously AUSMIN coming up. It's looking like Australia will host that. That's obviously the defence and foreign affairs ministers from their equivalents in America come here. So there's a lot of engagement.
What's going on? Speaking of that FaceTime, it's time to talk to the Shadow Foreign Minister, Simon Birmingham. And to take us there, he was the Prime Minister sitting alongside Joe Biden, welcoming this new climate compact with the United States.
Australia is back around the table. And what we know is that action on climate change, I say, is the entry fee to credibility in the Indo-Pacific. Many of our neighbours understand that climate change is an existential threat. And what we understand is that it's an important component of our national security, and that's why it is an important component, an essential part of our alliance.
Simon Birmingham, welcome to the program.
Good morning, David. Great to be with you.
So the two leaders have signed this new climate compact. They've elevated the issue to what they're calling a central pillar of the alliance. Do you agree climate change is now an essential element of the US alliance?
Well, it is an essential issue for us to work cooperatively with our partner nations on. This compact, this agreement is welcome, and it is complementary with agreements that Australia previously signed under the coalition government with Germany, with Japan, Singapore or the United Kingdom, where we established green economy agreements and cooperative arrangements to be able to ensure that the $22 billion that we'd put in place for clean energy investment and transition of Australia's economy to net zero was done in concert with the types of countries who are going to be essential to help us get low-cost technological transformation. And that is what the United States, under President Biden and through his Inflation Reduction Act, is in particular doing, investing significantly in lower-cost technologies to help enable the transition to net zero. And it's critical for Australia to be part of that journey, as we are already with a number of other nations through such cooperative arrangements.
Makes it a bit harder for you, doesn't it, to consider watering down Australia's climate targets?
Well, David, I wouldn't want to see Australia water down our climate targets.
So you support the climate targets?
David, the challenge of getting to net zero is going to be a difficult one for all the countries of the world. It will take maximum cooperation between us, and it does entail all of us making sure that we work through the different means of technological investment to get the types of outcomes that can ensure change, not just in our energy markets, but critically in terms of industrial emissions, transport emissions, agricultural emissions. There are a range of different sectors of all of our economies that need that type of investment and technological change to make net zero an actual reality.
OK, but we have a climate target legislated. The Libs didn't vote for it. And I haven't heard this before, but you just said you don't want that watered down. You do support Australia's climate targets now.
David, I don't want to see Australia take backward steps in terms of our emissions targets. Now, of course, under the Paris Agreement, there are 5 yearly steps for us to take in terms of updating those targets. Whoever is in government to each point in time will have to assess what is going to be feasible in terms of those 5 yearly updates under the Paris Agreement and do so in consideration of how that technology is evolving, what the impacts on Australian jobs and industry will be, and what progress is being made around the rest of the world. But partnerships like this one will be important to helping to ensure that we do make that type of progress.
That's interesting. The Quad meeting, it went ahead last night. How important is this grouping and what do you envisage for its future?
The Quad is important. It brings together 4 Indo-Pacific democratic maritime powers and in doing so 4 countries who can speak with common values to our region about the type of region we wish to see, as you were highlighting before, a region that is indeed open and secure, peaceful and prosperous, one in which countries aren't forced to make a choice but feel empowered in their own sovereignty. It's an ability to cooperate across a range of different spheres in relation to supporting a rules-based order that has enabled prosperity and lifting people out of poverty across our region over a number of decades now, right across Southeast Asia and across the subcontinent into India and elsewhere. We have seen a massive change in terms of lifestyle and living standards, underpinned largely by open trade, growing exchange of goods, growing exchange of technology and commerce around the region, and a rules-based order that has helped to transform the lives of hundreds of millions. And that's why it's so important we work together to preserve that. On
China, the Prime Minister's now been invited to visit Beijing. Do you think he should go before all of the trade sanctions are lifted?
I think Australia does deserve to have absolute clarity that these trade sanctions are going to be lifted and that clarity should be there before the Prime Minister entertains a formal state visit to Beijing. And why? Well, because China is acting very clearly in breach of its commitments to Australia. China is acting in breach of its commitments under the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. It's acting in breach of commitments it's given in a number of regional trade compacts with Australia, and it's acting in breach of its commitments to the World Trade Organization. Now, it's clear China did not want that independent global umpire, the World Trade Organization, to hand down findings against it, which is why it negotiated the process in relation to the barley dispute that was initiated with China.
Well, they still haven't lifted those barley tariffs, have they?
They have not lifted them, and we should expect them to be lifted completely, as we should the tariffs on our wine industry, and we should expect nothing less than China to adhere to the terms it entered into under the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement.
Before the PM goes there, so just to be clear, you're saying the PM shouldn't go until all that's happened?
We've had lots of good steps in terms of dialogue. It was counterproductive of China to refuse to have ministerial level dialogue with Australia, and as an opposition we have given absolute bipartisan support to the Albanese government to re-enter into dialogue with China. And it's good that the Prime Minister's had that dialogue, as has the Deputy Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister and the Trade Minister. And we've welcomed each of those, but there is a point where we should expect clear outcomes and that China should adhere to the terms of the China-Australia FTA without seeking concession or conditions from Australia, other than that we equally adhere to those terms, as we have been a good partner in doing so.
What about the detention of Cheng Lei and Yang Hengjun, the 2 Australian citizens? Should that be cleared up? Should they even be released before the PM goes, or is that a separate matter in your mind?
Well, it is obviously a different matter, but still a very, very important and significant matter. It is a matter that I know the Prime Minister and every official, as in the previous government, raises at every opportunity, as they should. And we should be expecting to see progress in relation to that. There are obviously China's own legal processes, but the unfair detention, the lack of transparency in relation to those detained Australians is completely unacceptable, and we should continue to seize every opportunity to prosecute that case.
Let's turn to a couple of domestic matters. It's nearly 2 weeks now since the budget, 2 weeks since the increase in JobSeeker was proposed by the government. Have you worked out whether you support an increase in JobSeeker yet?
We'll go through our normal processes once we see the legislation for this, but Peter Dutton has proposed an important alternative, that would help Australians who are willing to and looking to engage in the workforce. The reality is across the Australian economy we do face workforce shortages at present. Many employers are still looking for people to do extra hours, to take on different shifts, and the proposal we've put in place to help job seekers keep more of what they earn is a valuable one that economists have said would actually put some downward pressure on inflation because it would increase capacity across the economy.
Have you worked out the cost of that proposal yet?
Well, as has been indicated, that's been worked through with the Parliamentary Budget Office in terms of the final costings arrangements.
So did you sign off on a policy that you don't know the cost of?
We've outlined an alternative at this stage, David. We are not at an election, and we're not about to form government in the next 2 years. We'll take our fully costed policies to the next election. But in terms of in the couple of days after the Labor Party handed down its budget,
oppositions don't need to cost policies. Is that what you're saying?
No, I just said we will take fully costed policies to the next election. That's exactly what I said, and that is what we will do. But in terms of the 2 days after the budget was handed down, we put forward an alternative that it's clear under anybody's analysis will cost less than what the government's proposal is, but one that will help Australians to get into the workforce, making things better for employers, making things better for those Australians who take those extra hours when they're on job seeker, and putting a bit of downward pressure on inflation, which is so critical at this time to help all Australians.
It's also 2 weeks since the government announced plans to change the petroleum resource rent tax to raise an extra $2.4 billion. The gas industry is broadly okay with it. Are you?
Well, again, our concerns are primarily the fact that the government seems to have waged a continuous war on the gas sector, an important export earner for Australia, an important revenue source and critical for our domestic industry. Now, the PRRT has been subject, as you know, of a number of reviews and analysis, and in some ways these changes may be the least of the industry's concerns relative to the other things the government has done that creates investment risk around the PRRT. And so, again, when we see the detail of the legislation from the government, we will go through our proper processes, we'll engage with industry thoroughly around that and come to a conclusion about our position in the Parliament. But we are concerned
surely if the industry is okay with it, you're not going to say no, are you?
Well, that's why we'll sit down with industry and do our own analysis once we've seen that detail of the legislation. The government's made an announcement, but we need to obviously see that to come to a final position. But elsewhere, we have grave concerns that the government's interventions in the gas market have hurt Australia's standing in terms of international investors, and in doing so jeopardise the affordability of energy in Australia, and through that the job generation and elsewhere that comes from that very strong export industry.
It's 12 months today since the Coalition's election defeat. You appeared on this program morning after the election, as I'm sure you recall.
I do.
You said the Liberal Party had lost professionals and women in particular. You said the party had to regroup to win them back. What has the party done since then to win back the professionals and the women that you were talking about?
Well, the test for us will be at the next election in terms of taking forward a set of policies, a set of candidates and a campaign approach that does win back those cohorts of voters who we lost. And the work, of course, is underway in terms of policy development. We need to see outcomes in terms of candidate selection as well. And these are very important tasks for the party. It's an ongoing task, and it's one that needs to reach a crescendo at that point of the next election to give voters the confidence that we heard messages from the last election. There will be different issues at play at the next election in terms of course, the pressures Australians are feeling in their household budgets, the areas of broken promises from the Albanese government in terms of where they promised lower electricity prices, real wage increases and other factors.
No, I appreciate your lines of attack there, but can I just take you back to the question? What have you done in the first 12 months of this term to win back those groups?
Well, importantly, policy work is taking place within the Coalition to make sure that we can present, I trust, compelling messages at the next election, and they need to be compelling around how it is we demonstrate our continued commitment economically, but also, as we started this interview, our commitment on matters such as climate change and how we do that in a way that demonstrates to people we are sincere about achieving net zero. The role that
well,
we
you
can
voted
play in terms
against
of
the
being
climate
realistic
targets. You
about
voted
policy.
against the safeguards mechanism. Do you think that helped?
That is where our alternative policies have to be convincing and compelling for Australians, David, and that is the test that we will face at the next election.
What does that mean?
I'm very cognizant
what does that
of.
mean? I mean, give us a sense, because we haven't seen anything in the first 12 months. Are you saying behind the scenes you've got some secret plan that's going to wow us on the climate front?
Well, it means that we will be outlining clear policies in the lead up to the next election. You wouldn't expect that oppositions do that 2 years out from a scheduled election. You know full well that that is done in an orderly manner, much closer to an election time frame, when they are fully developed, when they are fully costed, and when they can be released cognizant of the circumstances we will all face at that time of the next election. The circumstances now are different to what they were 12 months ago. We've seen Australia go from having some of the lowest inflation rates among major developed economies to having indeed amongst the highest inflation rates of major developed economies. We've got a government now that is forecasting lower growth and higher unemployment than had been previously forecast. So we will face quite different circumstances to what we did 12 months ago. And they're the challenges that we'll have to confront in our policies.
On the Indigenous voice, you've previously said you wanted to wait for the parliamentary committee to do its work on this before deciding which way you'll go. They've now wrapped up their work. So what will you do, support or oppose the voice?
David, I won't be acting contrary to the party position on this, but I do urge the government to look, listen and think about the types of comments we've seen from Mick Gooda and others in recent days. We do see very clearly a view that is emerging that the approach the government is taking is increasing the risk in relation to this referendum. I don't think it is a good thing for Australia that we end up in a situation with a referendum likely to fail. It is far better if the government goes back to the drawing board, and indeed if the members of the working group and other Indigenous leaders think hard about the type of advice they're hearing from the likes of Mick Gooda and give the government licence and room to move such that people could take a fresh look at this again and reconsider the way in which it is handled.
There's no sign they're going to do that. So if it goes forward as proposed, will you vote for it or against it?
As I said, I'm not going to act contrary to our party position on it, David, but
what are you going to do? Are you going to vote for it or against it?
Well, our party position's out there in terms of...
I know what that position is. That's to vote no.
In terms of not supporting
I'm just asking
the change.
your position.
And
What's your position?
Well, that's, as I said, I'm not going to act contrary to that party position.
You'll vote no?
That's the party position.
So you'll vote no?
And I'm not going to act contrary to it.
That means you'll vote no?
That is the party position, David, and I'm not going to act contrary to it.
In terms of your own vote?
And David, look, there are many issues Australia faces at present. This will be an important debate. I think it is unfortunate this debate has been mishandled by the government in terms of getting to the position it is. There's an opportunity for them to reconsider the way in which they put this to the people. And if that means it takes a little bit longer, that won't be necessarily a bad thing in terms of trying to get this to a position where we could actually have a unifying moment as a nation.
Final one, 12 months for Peter Dutton as opposition leader. We've seen one by-election defeat in Aston. You've got another by-election coming up in Fadden now after Stuart Roberts' resignation. Can the leader afford to lose 2 by-elections?
Well, we'll put a strong campaign forward in Fadden, and I am confident that Peter and the whole team will be working hard in that by-election.
He's got to win it, right?
And off the back of the most recent budget, we do have a different set of circumstances in terms of very clearly being able to point to a government now that is projecting lower growth, higher unemployment, that real wages are in fact going backwards,
but he's got to win this by-election, Peter Dutton?
Well, we always want to win a by-election. We want to make sure we win this one for sure, and the issues we'll campaign on, clearly the track record of the government, the broken promises of the government. 1 year on from the election of the Albanese government, most Australians are feeling worse off, not better off, and that is a key factor in terms of how we will campaign and the approach we will take to hold them to account. Simon Birmingham, appreciate your time this morning. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, David. My pleasure. Well, let's get back to our panel. We're joined once again by Phil Coorey, Clare Armstrong and Shalailah Medhora. Look, just quickly, a couple of things there. The climate target position, I don't want to see any
weakening of existing targets. They didn't vote for these targets, but Simon Birmingham feels pretty...
Well, you know, Simon's a leading moderate, and he argued internally that they should, I think, back the safeguard mechanism. And I don't know if he argued to actually legislate the target, but you know, his views on climate change are sort of...
It's probably sort of sniffing the wind a bit as well, because voters overwhelmingly want deeper action on climate change, and if the coalition wants to remain relevant, particularly with young voters, it's got to take a position on this.
There'll be a debate at the next election, whenever it is, about the 2035 target. So I think that debate will move forward, and we'll see how the two sides line up on that. On China, though, I thought that was interesting too. Simon Birmingham saying, Claire, that those trade sanctions have to be lifted before the PM should go. I don't think Anthony Albanese's been quite as adamant about that, but he is clearly hinting to China, reminding China that they do need to lift these trade sanctions. Yeah,
well, the Albanese government's now had two cabinet ministers in Penny Wong and Don Farrell visit China and meet their counterparts. We haven't seen any concrete, I guess, sign that the remainder of the trade sanctions, particularly on wine, are moving. I don't think the PM will necessarily wait until, you know, there's free flow of goods between the two countries, partly because, for example, the deal they came to over barley has sort of time markers baked into it over several months. So, you know, unless we're talking about a trip next year, he'd barely get to the end of that process. But the signal is clear that there needs to be some shift on trade. The balancing act is that China obviously feels that it is aggrieved around several issues, things like Chinese investment in Australia. So when you start asking for things in return for essentially dialogue, that actually undermines a lot of what the government has been saying for the last year, which is they just, you know, all talking is good and you don't want to have preconditions. Penny Wong's most quoted thing must be no preconditions for dialogue. So they have to be careful in not pushing
about making
too
demands.
hard.
Yeah, that's interesting. The relationship feels like, Phil, we're entering a kind of a new phase. It's not going back to what it once was.
Stabilise rather than normalise.
Yeah, what's it going to look like?
Well, very transactional, I suspect. You know, I mean, the government says we'll never go back to the happy days of the John Howard era, you know, when we all got rich off each other. It's now, that was normal. This is now about stabilising it. So, you know, just being pragmatic about it. But to Claire's point, I think, you know, Albanese has to be careful. You know, it's a very good thing we're all talking again, and sanctions are starting to be lifted and so forth, but China hasn't actually said what they want yet. And when they talk about, you know, investment in Australia, you know, we know that they'd like to get into critical minerals, into critical infrastructure and stuff, and there's just a whole bunch of no-go zones as far as our government's concerned. So it's going to be a bit of a delicate dance, I think, over the next few months as we build up to the Prime Minister's visit, about who wants what and keeping it all civil. It's
Well, the Chinese ambassador did announce the other day that the sanctions on Australian timber have now been lifted.
There is a conclusion done after a serious study based on the materials provided by the Australian side regarding some of the, I don't know the detail, but it's about the quarantine of those timbers. That would be, they have to satisfy the conditions of the Chinese customs. Now the conclusion is basically satisfy that conclusion. So from today on, the Australian timber is going back to China.
Apparently the quality of the timber's now fine.
Just like that.
Quarantine issues
The quarantining
resolved.
standards are
No more weevils in the beef. Yeah.
That's right. And you would expect we will see some of those other areas progressively lifted as well, we will see. Today, of course, marks 12 months since the election of the Albanese government. It feels like a lot longer than that. So much has happened. So much, in fact, that we've put together a quick little recap of the last year.
I am humbled by this victory, and I'm honoured to be given the opportunity to serve as the 31st Prime Minister of Australia.
The election delivered only a one-seat majority for Labor, but an enormous change in the political landscape. It was a speedy transition for Anthony Albanese, who was quickly sworn in as Prime Minister so he could attend a Quad leaders meeting in Tokyo. He spent much of the first year on the global stage, patching up relations in the Pacific, visiting Ukraine to show Australia's support, stepping out of the diplomatic deep freeze with China, receiving a rockstar reception alongside Narendra Modi in India, and locking in a nuclear submarine future with AUKUS partners. On the home front, enshrining an Indigenous voice in the Constitution was set as an early priority. The Prime Minister laying the groundwork for a referendum later this year, despite a lack of bipartisan support. The PM refusing to water down the wording, supported by his working group of Indigenous leaders.
I regard as a great privilege to be standing with the giants of Australia.
In Parliament, the government passed its new climate targets into law and strengthened the safeguards mechanism. A National Anti-Corruption Commission will come to life in July. The Treasurer produced 2 budgets, with modest help for the most vulnerable and a rare surplus now on the cards. But it's the steady rise in interest rates that's caused the most grief over the past year in the ongoing battle against inflation. On this first anniversary of the election, the Prime Minister's back in Japan for a G7 meeting. With a weakening economy and an uncertain referendum campaign ahead, the next 12 months will likely be more difficult than the first. So, look, Labor is clearly in a stronger position than it was 12 months ago in the polls and in the Parliament after winning a by-election. There have been no big scandals internally that have really caused too much of a problem. Promises have been delivered. I think people are pretty comfortable with Anthony Albanese as Prime Minister. Shalailah, how would you sort of score what have been the strengths, weaknesses of the first 12 months of the government?
I think the first 12 months have been marked by this softly approach, right? Like Anthony Albanese is trying to set himself up as a safe pair of hands. He's not going to rock the boat too much. He's really trying to capture this middle ground of centrism, right? But I think the issue that Anthony Albanese faces is that when he looks at who elected him, he was largely elected off the back of young people. The last Australian election survey, which the ANU does every year, was really shocking for the coalition. Only 1 in 4 people under the age of 40 voted for the coalition. Largely young people voted for Labor. And they voted for Labor because they want radical change. They want bold initiatives in a lot of policy areas that have frankly been sort of neglected under the last 10 years of the coalition. We're not seeing that. So while the softly approach might actually help to change some people who may potentially have been looking towards the coalition and might have a natural leaning towards the coalition, Labor is really in serious danger of losing those young people who voted them in hoping for something big and radical and a change to the status quo. So I think that's a really big issue that Labor is going to have to tackle in going forward towards the next election, because the Greens are in a really good position to snap up a couple of those inner city seats.
Yeah, I would add to that, like they've really consolidated the ground. I guess they've long contested with the coalition, but not necessarily shored up. I think we will see more, Greens really on the attack. We will see more teal seats, for example, potentially rise. Not necessarily only in traditional coalition inner city areas. There's always that possibility. But broadly, I think as well, it's important to acknowledge that the kinds of issues that I guess you could say are broken in the system are not the kind you can turn around in 3 years anyway. And I think what we've seen from the Prime Minister, it's been interesting. He's been giving interviews on the anniversary and these warnings to progressives to be patient. I mean, progress does take time, and you cannot fix the NDIS overnight. You cannot reform Medicare overnight. You can't build 1 million houses overnight, although government are certainly trying. And I think that is what this really feels like, actually, is a longer-term plan hinging on winning 2025.
Well, he wants to be there for more than one term.
That's what he says. I mean, he's been saying since the get-go, we want to be Labor, we want to be the natural party of government. It's going to require 2 or 3 terms to embed your reforms. And he's also said repeatedly that the first term has to be about creating the tone, getting the goodwill of the electorate, not breaking promises. I did an interview with him back in Easter, and he said, look what happened to Tony Abbott. He got in, released that 2014 budget, he was out in his ear in 18 months. I mean, it's all about building towards. I think they've been a very good first-year government. Whether you agree with what they have done or what they haven't done, they've been very busy. The ministers have all done a lot in their respective portfolios. As the Parliament, I can't remember a time in my 20 million years in Canberra where the Parliament has just been rolling through legislation.
It's been very policy busy.
They've restored the policy focus back. It reminds me a bit of the Howard days. If you use the parliament, then you're always talking about what you're doing, and
you're on your agenda.
all the time.
And
what about this point Shalailah makes, Phil? Because you wrote this week too about how the government's thinking about the Greens and the prospect of what might happen at the next election.
It's a good point. It's a good point Shalailah raised. I mean, the Prime Minister on Monday just had that sort of slip. I said his veil had slipped, where he was jumping on the Greens for not supporting his housing fund, and he said, this is why we need majority government. And I was, well, who mentioned minority government? Because it is a concern.
It's in the back of
They only have 78 seats, right? Yeah, 75's minority. As Claire said then, the Greens have stopped playing ball. The Greens are now, it's the old Malachi crunch. You've got Dutton on the right, who's just decided to play hardball on the PRRT and things like that. He's not going to give them anything. And the Greens are now really amping up on the left. Now, a lot of their demands are just completely undeliverable or wackily expensive or whatever, but it's appealing because it's empathising with the kids, right?
It's not just young people, though. I think this is a massive
but that's the key demographic.
Housing is a big issue
well,
across the board.
It is. Well, what did Adam Band said on this show, where the Press Club, we're now the party of the renters, right?
And that demographic's huge.
Yeah. So
what's going on the Labor backbench on housing at the moment? Was there a little murmur or two this week about
a frisson?
Yeah.
A frisson of pressure.
A bit of being spooked, I think, by the prospects. I think, as I was saying, I think housing is such a massive issue spanning across different demographics. It's not just young people. Obviously, they are at the coalface here when it comes to not having secure housing, when it comes to being able to rent increases going up, not having home ownership rates slipping. But it's a concern for older demographics because they're worried about what their kids are going to do. They're worried if they're going to leave their kids in a better situation than what they are in. So I think this is a massive issue that Labor has to tackle. It hasn't been tackling.
Is the push on to do something on negative gearing and capital gains tax? Is that a serious push from the backbench?
I think that is because I think there's a feeling of inequity that young people particularly have around taxation at the moment. And by saying we're going to change negative gearing, it appears to be fixing an issue of inequity, but it doesn't actually give you outcomes. It doesn't fix the housing crisis.
It reflects the anger.
It reflects the anger.
But as the Prime Minister said, we're not touching that. Like, negative gearing is like work choices for Labor. So
you reckon there's no chance?
Well, it goes back to the point I was making about not breaking promises and engendering goodwill. Now, it doesn't mean they may not look at... if you're looking at housing affordability, you're actually better at looking at the capital gains tax deduction for investors if you want to. But all that stuff has to be the next term. It can't be this term.
But I think that's the point, though, right? Like, they're very carefully couching everything they're saying on these issues in the context of this term. And one thing, talking about, a year of growth, I think this government is in the main getting better at is floating balloons. Look at how the raise to JobSeeker was handled versus the super changes. You had backbenchers coming out almost in organised procession. I'm sure they would deny that, and they were very much, just coming out on the courage of their convictions. And of course, it was more that they'd been unleashed than suddenly had a change of heart. And then we had policy development. I think that this government has always said that they're looking to have these conversations with the public. Sometimes they'll be difficult, and this could be the start of the next difficult one.
What about 12 months for Peter Dutton? It certainly hasn't been an easy 12 months, picking up from the defeat, losing a by-election. You had the Morrison Ministries saga early on as well. Listening to Simon Birmingham there, he's sort of suggesting the policies will come to win back these cohorts.
I was surprised by his response to your questioning on that. They had a budget reply 5 minutes ago in which they unveiled a suite of policies, and maybe this is too generous of an interpretation on my part, but when I see doubling of mental health sessions funded under Medicare, when I see moves to restrict advertising and gambling at sports, when I see $5 million for a review of female-specific items on...
You should have answered this question.
Well, I had to write about it, so that's why it's at the top of my head. To me, that was a play for women and professionals.
And young people.
And I think actually what people sometimes forget about the first 2 years of Albo's time as opposition leader was, sure, he wasn't coming out with big policies and big hits every day, but he was building a narrative. He was building values.
He did have a couple of big ones early on.
And it seems like Dutton has these sort of moments where you could have a conversation and he doesn't build a narrative.
He is Phil reliable. Today he's got some ads out there that are about broken promises and rates going up and all your costs going up.
But that's all negative.
Does that work?
But I think it was a bit more than that. I mean, the big sort of line out of that budget reply was the job seeker response. Rather than just increase the rate, let the unemployed work a bit more, right? And that by virtue would get more people back. Now, maybe it uncosted and there may be hairs on it and whatever, but it's a bit like the Greens are doing, just throw out the popular idea. Now, that was a return to basic first principles for the Liberal Party, right? They're getting back to, that's the old, work is better than welfare, low taxes, the PRRT decision. Now, that's more about getting seats in WA, I think, than anything else. Dutton is starting to put down these markers now about, on the economy and sort of, that's one thing the Liberal Party can agree on, right? Yeah, and they might fight on climate and stuff like that, but they're all...
That's right. And I think that's why the budget reply was probably one of his better contributions.
I think I just more mean the narrative. It's not that those policies and those principles aren't there and aren't being thought about, but it's, it was just a...
One of the difficulties the Liberals have, and this is a more structural issue amongst their base, their membership, is this division, certainly at the state level. I don't know if you saw these pictures. Let's have a look. This was the Liberal Party State Conference in Victoria, members walking out on the leader, John Pesutto. This is all over the booting out of Moira Deeming. Some of them had Moira Deeming masks they're waving around. I mean, what does this tell us about what's going on in the Liberal
Look at the demographic of who's in this, first of all. It's very heavily skewed towards older people, and that is a massive issue for the Liberal Party if they don't have regeneration. If they're focusing solely on this one group of people who are now no longer the dominant voting group, by the way. Millennials are equal to boomers when it comes to voting power. And if they're not looking at how are we going to refresh the party, they're dooming themselves to failure. And one of Dutton's major issues, from my perspective, is that he isn't talking to everyone. As opposition leader, you need to cast your net far and wide. He's not doing that. He's talking to his traditional base, and that's it. And that's not how you win votes.
It also shows that Victoria is just a massive problem for the Liberal Party. I mean, they'll win fat in a canter, I suspect, the Libs. It's up in Queensland, it's a safe seat, But what we saw in Aston was emblematic. Now, Victoria is going to get a pretty horrible budget handed down this week, according to the Sunday Age. The cost of those lockdowns is now,
coming home.
In economic terms, is going to be writ large this week. The Liberal Party here needs to be in a position to exploit that.
Capitalise on that.
What we see there is a classic case of of individuals who think they're bigger than the party, that their personal bugbear or their personal gripe or the consequences of their behaviour outweighs the greater good, and they need to deal with
I think it also comes down to what Birmingham mentioned before, which is candidates. Can they win fat and easily?
That was interesting.
Yes, they can. Will they put a woman who could end up being a future Liberal minister in a in a Liberal government? That's a big old question mark.
Issue.
And I think that until they deal with that candidate issue, the question of the impacts of those kinds of meetings remains a big question.
Our panel, Phil Coorey, Clare Armstrong and Shalailah Medhora, will be back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with crowd-funded cartoonist Glen Le Lievre, and a very warm welcome, Glen.
Thanks, Mike.
Glen, a great and powerful friend was going to swing by Australia and see us all, but he had to go back and deal with his debt ceiling. Mark Knight's drawn the leader of the free world here with some problems on his government credit card. It's insufficient funds.
Yes, America's broke. Who knew? Here I was thinking they were merely morally bankrupt.
Yeah. Changed the name of the aircraft to Air Force None.
Yes, but that's a well-grounded airplane right there. You can see the engines are resting quite firmly on... It's exhausted.
Looks like we're not going to Australia, says the security chap. It's quite frightening, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because if they sneeze, we catch pneumonia.
They should just borrow on our inheritance like normal countries do.
Lovely David Rose. Say it ain't so, Joe.
Joe, hey, it's Albo. Anthony Albanese. Yeah, no problem. Next time.
Yeah, it's been quite a blow, really, hasn't it?
But President's wearing pitch black sunglasses. I mean, it's one more way that dealing with America these days is like gazing into the abyss.
Yeah. They say what goes up must come down, but unfortunately that doesn't apply to global temperatures. And you've drawn a pretty, it ain't easy being green, Tanya Plebiscite.
Green is also the colour of money.
It's a pretty bleak-looking environment out her ministerial window.
It is.
I did love this. We seem to have been overheating the earth in her padded cell.
We are. We're going to break 1.5 degrees in 5 years. Apparently so. Mike, we're headed for our very own dystopian science fiction movie.
Yep.
You might call it Planet of the Bakes.
Planet of the... A beautiful Koudelka. He's got political capture and storage technology, major left-wing party with double stitching on the top pocket, major right-wing party.
Crafty bit of politics, that?
Yes, yeah.
I've got you right where you want me.
Yep, making a commenter on big carbon.
Yes,
Yeah.
Labor government in the corner right pocket.
There was scandal in Canberra as a major international firm was accused of putting the con back in consultancy.
Yes, indeed. Price Waterhouse in desperate need of a rebrand at this point.
Former Prime Minister Scott Morrison was going to be employed, but they decided there was considerable chance of reputational damage. Lovely David Pope, who's got former Prime Minister sitting outside the Government Contracts Office of Price Waterhouse Coopers, and people jumping with what looks to be parachutes and money maybe packed in there.
Should be gold, shredding. All the hallmarks of a successful Prime Minister's office.
Yeah. I'm not trying to talk down your chances, kid, but this job has my name all over it.
ScoMo should have been a shoe-in. He had references from 5 secret ministers and a picture of an eagle.
The price is definitely right.
Yeah.
Lovely Kathy Wilcox, who's commenting on the Price Waterhouse Coopers scandal. I've always found that with a generous donation, we get a decent voice into the making of laws that affect us.
Same. Who needs a change in the Constitution?
Yeah, right. Glenn, so many people are really struggling at the moment, and one of their battles is on the home front, or finding a home. This beautifully simple and powerful Kathy Wilcox cartoon sums it up.
It's gorgeous. Mike, find someone who runs after you like that little girl is running after her dream of a home.
Yeah, that's right. It's just disappearing up into the stratosphere. Bye.
See you later.
Cloud. Glenn, it's been a great pleasure unpicking the events this week, and I'll let you do the honours.
Back to you, David Speers.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Shalailah.
So during the last election, Labor promised to look at instituting a national respectful relationships program in its school curriculum. That was put in the budget. There's money set aside for that. And last week they announced the experts who are going to help shape this. So it's actually a really exciting time. I think this is a really important program that teaches young people about identifying abusive behaviour and navigating those tricky conversations around consent. So it's going to be one to watch.
Interesting. Claire.
US President Joe Biden may not be visiting PNG tomorrow, but Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is. I understand an Australian representative will be there for that signing of the Security Pact. But more significantly, Australia is working on its own pact with PNG, and hoping that that will be done within the next few months. So I think really an important indicator of how significant the Pacific is shaping up to be in the regional dynamic.
Yeah, indeed. Phil.
Parliament back this week, and over the next month we'll debate the final wording of the question for the referendum on the voice, with the contentious bit being about advising the executive. We saw last week the sort of breakout between Mick Gooder and Noel Pearson. As someone who covered the Republic, remembers it well, the thing that killed that more than anything else was a split in the Yes camp. And people don't have to understand why it's split, they just have to know it's split, and it's going to dissuade them from voting it. So I would caution advocates, whatever they agree to, stick with it and back it in, because if you split, the thing's dead.
Indeed. All right, thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, the Canadian Prime Minister has come up with a new diplomatic pose. Justin Trudeau had to adjust his height when meeting the Speaker of the South Korean Assembly. The result was a little awkward. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
You're making us all feel very excited about being